You know, usually when we talk about problem solving, there's this underlying assumption that grit is basically the ultimate answer.
Right, yeah. We frame it almost entirely as an issue of just, effort and persistence.
Exactly. You encounter a roadblock, and the conventional wisdom just points at it and says, focus harder, work smarter, dig deeper.
Just put your head down and push through the friction, right?
Yeah, exactly. But the text we are diving into today takes that entire philosophy of, digging deeper and just it throws it completely out the window.
It really does. It demands a much more radical approach.
Yeah. So for this deep dive, we're looking at a fascinating essay by Su Feng, and it was edited by Kinyu from June 26, 2023. And it carries a really direct title. It's called, If a Problem Seems Unsolvable, Explore Beyond Its Boundaries.
And, the mission of our discussion today is really to explore the author's central thesis here, which argues that true innovation, like the kind of problem solving that fundamentally changes reality, it never actually happens by staring harder at the problem.
Right.
It happens by entirely changing the landscape in which the problem even exists.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the author starts us off with this foundational metaphor that I think just sets the stakes perfectly.
Yeah, it's a great image.
It is. So I want you, listening right now, to imagine a group of people living their entire lives inside a dim, dark, damp cave.
Okay.
And these are highly motivated, intelligent people. They study the cave ecosystem. They're analyzing the moisture levels on the stalactites.
Right, they're really doing the work.
Exactly. They strive, they organize, and they work incredibly hard to engineer this gloomy, wet cavern into a sunny, comfortable environment.
Which sounds noble, right?
Right, but the author's thesis lands with total finality here. They say doing all of that is just entirely futile. You literally cannot optimize a damp cavern into a sunny meadow.
Yeah, you just can't.
The only way to resolve the discomfort is to stop contemplating the interior walls entirely and just step completely outside.
Yeah.
You step out into the bright spring scenery, the clear mountains, the fresh air.
And suddenly, all those complex problems you were trying to solve inside.
They just vanish.
Right. They aren't solved, really. They're just rendered irrelevant.
Yes. What's fascinating here is...
What's fascinating here is how accurately this captures human psychology. Like, we have this profound instinct to double down on our immediate surroundings.
Oh, totally.
We want to master the environment we know rather than, questioning if the environment itself is the actual constraint.
It's so true.
We treat the parameters of our current situation as if they're absolute laws of physics, when in reality they're just the walls of whatever cognitive boundary we happen to be standing inside at the time.
Yeah, you have to actually leave the boundary to even conceptualize the sky.
Exactly.
And what makes this source material so compelling to me is that the author doesn't just leave this as some abstract philosophical thought experiment.
Right. They bring the receipts.
Yeah, they do. They anchor this concept to a very stark recorded historical reality to demonstrate how this mechanism actually functions in practice. So they take us to August 1896 in China.
Okay.
And the text paints a very specific picture of the internal reality of that boundary at that exact moment in history. So men are wearing long braids, women have bound feet.
It's a very different world.
Completely. The transportation infrastructure is basically ox carts and horse carriages. You're looking at architecture made of mud, earth roads where a gust of wind just creates this blinding dust. There's widespread poverty and, critically, a total lack of electricity.
Right.
The text actually makes a point to mention there wasn't even a flashlight.
Wow, not even a flashlight. And then the text provides the catalyst, right? The moment of stepping outside.
Yeah.
Because during that exact same time period, Li Hongzhang, who was a prominent Chinese diplomat, visits the United States.
Right.
We have to look at what he witnessed through the lens of someone stepping out of that metaphorical closed-loop system we just talked about.
Yeah.
He saw skyscrapers. He saw cars instead of ox carts. He saw men in modern suits, women bearing their chests and shoulders, which, represented an immense cultural and social shock at the time.
Oh, absolutely.
And perhaps most fundamentally, he saw indoor electric lights.
The text draws a very sharp conclusion from this event. They argue that if Li Hongzhang had not ventured abroad, he would never have recognized the immense backwardness of his own country at that time.
He wouldn't have even known it was possible to be behind, right?
Exactly. He wouldn't have known what was biologically or physically possible. And it makes me think of an analogy, like, imagine you are the most brilliant inventor in a localized system where the only light source is fire.
Okay, yeah.
And your whole life's work is trying to invent a slightly better, longer-lasting beeswax candle.
You're optimizing the wax. You're looking at the wick.
Tweaking the airflow, yeah.
Yeah.
You are an absolute master of candles,
Yeah.
but you are completely unaware that someone in a different system next door has already wired an entire building for electricity. You don't need a better candle. You need to understand the concept of a light bulb. But you can't invent a light bulb by studying wax. The materials in your current system simply do not contain the adjacent possible required to make that leap.
That concept of the adjacent possible is exactly why this matters to you listening right now. You don't know you're in the dark until you see the light.
Yeah.
The contrast Li Hongshang experienced wasn't just about realizing, oh, other people have different buildings. It was the complete shattering of a cognitive ceiling.
Shattering.
Because when you exist inside a closed system, your imagination is strictly limited by the parameters and the vocabulary of that system. You literally cannot conceptualize a skyscraper if your entire architectural and engineering vocabulary is predicated on mud and earth.
Right.
Stepping outside provides the external vocabulary needed to even begin thinking about entirely new categories of solutions.
And I want to be really clear for you listening, just as we unpack this.
Yeah.
We are looking at these historical observations completely impartially.
Very important to note.
Yeah, we are simply reporting the contrasts exactly as the author described them to illustrate this framework of problem solving. There is absolutely no moral judgment being passed on either nation's historical state here. We are strictly analyzing the mechanics of awareness.
Right. It's just about information asymmetry.
Exactly.
But recognizing that you are operating under a cognitive ceiling is one thing. Actually operationalizing that realization on a massive scale is something entirely different.
Oh, for sure.
So the author moves from a single diplomat's revelation in 1896 to a massive systemic macroeconomic shift in 1978, just to show how this translates into actionable change.
The economic data the text provides for 1978 is really revealing regarding the cost of this kind of isolation. So China's per capita GDP was $156.
Wow.
Yeah. And to establish the global context of that era, the text points out that the world's poorest countries in sub-Saharan Africa had a per capita GDP of $490.
So significantly higher.
Right.
Yeah.
Japan was at $8,821, the United States was at $10,600, and Monaco was up at $38,400.
And the author explicitly links this back to their thesis. They liken China in 1978 to a population that had simply never seen the outside world. The economic disparity wasn't just a gap in optimization. It wasn't about making the cave a little better. It was the result of existing in a completely different paradigm of development.
But then we see the decisive pivot, right? The text details how Chinese leaders abandoned the policy of isolation. They sent a massive wave of government officials worldwide, specifically investigating developed Western countries.
They stepped out of the cave.
They did. They deliberately broadened their horizons, exposing themselves to external systems, which initiated the policies of reform and opening up. And the result, according to the text, was over 30 years of rapid economic growth.
Yeah.
The author's conclusion on this is unambiguous. If they had stayed isolated, trying to study and generate development internally, keeping even that $156 GDP would have been difficult.
Because the system was tapped out.
Exactly. But, here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Because I want to challenge this idea of just wholesale adopting external systems.
Okay, play devil's advocate here.
Right. Doesn't stepping completely outside your boundary and importing a foreign paradigm risk fundamentally eroding your own identity? Like, when a nation or even just a company admits their internal systems are failing and decides to learn from outsiders, there's a massive amount of vulnerability involved.
Oh, huge vulnerability.
The natural human instinct, basically the ego usually dictates that we protect our identity, we double down, and we insist our way is still the best. It takes a massive swallowing of pride to step out and take notes from someone else's playbook.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, you've actually just identified the primary friction point of this entire philosophy.
Really?
Yeah. Whether we are talking about national policy or just your own personal and professional roadblocks, the ego acts as the ultimate gatekeeper to that boundary.
That makes a lot of sense.
It desperately wants to keep you inside a system where you feel competent and culturally secure, even if that system is mathematically failing you.
Wow.
But what the author is demonstrating through these historical examples is that investigating developed external systems provides a shortcut to growth that simply cannot be organically generated internally. You cannot internally deduce 30 years of advanced economic theory from scratch while your resources are dwindling.
Right, right.
You have to go observe it functioning in reality.
It's essentially acknowledging that reinventing the wheel is just a waste of time if you can walk outside and observe a functioning combustion engine.
Exactly.
And again, just as a quick reminder, we are exploring the author's specific economic examples here to understand their theory of problem solving. We are not endorsing any specific political ideologies. We are just analyzing the author's argument regarding the sheer data of isolation versus exploration.
Precisely. And, to the author's credit, they don't restrict this framework to just the macro level of nations and GDP.
No, they bring it right down to earth.
Yeah, they pull the lens all the way down to the micro level of daily bureaucratic friction, really just to demonstrate that this closed-loop thinking is not some historical relic. It dictates how we operate right now today.
Yeah, the author shares this modern, everyday anecdote about registering a company. They contrast their internal experiences with an experience in a foreign country where they completed the entire corporate registration process in under 10 minutes.
10 minutes.
10 minutes. No bribing officials, no leveraging personal connections or, knowing a guy.
Right.
They just selected a name, signed the paperwork, paid the fee, and received the complete documents. Just like that.
It's a completely different reality.
But surely that kind of frictionless efficiency comes with its own blind spots, right? I mean, fast systems can often lack robust checks and balances. Does the author address the risk of adopting a highly streamlined external process if it doesn't align with the complex cultural context of the system importing it?
So the author doesn't really dwell on the specific mechanics of the bureaucracy itself. They actually use that 10-minute registration as a localized example of a completely different operational baseline.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it's more of a springboard for a much grander critique of human history. They use that seamless external experience to ask a profound question. For thousands of years, how many people have actually lived happily, freely, and joyfully?
And the author's answer is incredibly bleak. They say very few. They characterize the vast majority of human history as being defined by distress, pain, conflict, oppression, anxiety, and fear.
Right. And this leads to the author's most severe critique, which is aimed at the people we historically and currently trust to solve this fundamental human misery.
The experts.
The experts. The text critiques the great figures, historical thinkers, modern internet thought leaders, high-ranking UN officials, world presidents.
Yeah.
The author argues that they are all fundamentally failing to alleviate this underlying distress. Why? Because these leaders and institutions are simply pondering, debating, and contemplating while remaining firmly inside the boundaries of established systems.
They're still in the cave.
Exactly.
It makes you question the very nature of institutional authority. Like, are the experts, the thought leaders, and the global politicians actually solving fundamental problems? Or are they just the most highly credentialed people operating within a closed loop?
That's the million-dollar question.
It's like having a brilliant, world-class engineer who dedicates their entire life to optimizing the wooden spokes on the wheels of a horse-drawn carriage.
Right.
They are undeniably a genius. And hey, the carriage ride's slightly smoother. But their genius is entirely misapplied because they are ignoring the fact that someone outside their discipline just invented the airplane.
Right. Yeah.
The carriage expert is a master of their internal parameters, but they are entirely irrelevant to the open sky.
This raises an important question about how we validate expertise. What the author is boldly claiming here is that standard institutional authority is very often just localized optimization. We award grants, degrees, and political power to people who figure out how to make a flawed system 1% more tolerable. And that explains why, despite having endless high-level global summits, intricate policy papers, and profound philosophical debates, the baseline of human conflict and distress remains largely unresolved.
Wow.
The institutions themselves are echo chambers. A modern global assembly hall might have sleek microphones and leather chairs, but if the underlying cognitive framework is closed off from radically different external paradigms, it is functionally just as limiting as a stone boundary.
So if the standard experts, the earthly masters, and our most prestigious institutions are all trapped in this cycle of internal optimization, where exactly do we look?
Right.
Where is outside? Because the text provides two very distinct maps for how to find the exit here. One is an ideological progression, and the other is an incredibly vast cosmic perspective.
Let's start with the ideological map, because it outlines a brilliant cross-disciplinary chain of problem solving. The author establishes a rigid rule for seeking truth, which is, Do not seek solutions and paths strictly within your own existing circle of knowledge.
The progression they lay out is fascinating to track. They argue that if a fundamental problem cannot be solved within Christianity, you must step out and look for answers in Buddhism.
Yeah.
If Buddhism lacks the framework you need, step out to Islam. If not Islam, look to Taoism. If Taoism hits a wall, step out to the frontiers of empirical science. And if science cannot quantify the solution, step out into theology and metaphysics.
It's a constant outward push.
You continually expand the boundary. The underlying logic is that for certain deeply entrenched problems, finding a solution from inside your native discipline is harder than ascending to the heavens. But when you step outside that discipline, you almost always discover that some other culture or some other field of study already mapped the solution centuries ago.
It's the ultimate defense against intellectual tribalism. We become so deeply embedded in our specific academic or cultural frameworks that we forget they are just tools. They aren't the entirety of reality. But then the author takes this philosophy to its absolute most extreme limit, the ultimate outward expansion. They suggest stepping out of the earth entirely.
Yes. The text states that we need to observe the 1,000-year world planet among the sea of stars.
Right.
And it claims that by following the way of life found there, all human problems would suddenly become clear and easily solvable. So what does this all mean? When the author talks about walking out of the earth to explore the 1,000-year world among the stars, is the text suggesting a literal search for an extraterrestrial civilization so we can copy their societal blueprint? Or is this the ultimate philosophical thought experiment, like a total radical detachment from our anthropic ego?
You know, it's a fascinating ambiguity in the text. But whether the author means it as a literal cosmic blueprint or as the most extreme metaphysical metaphor possible, the underlying psychological mechanism required from the reader is exactly the same. It's radical displacement.
Radical displacement. I like that.
The author is pushing us to realize that our entire earthly context, our history, our politics, our global economic systems, might be the ultimate closed loop. If you can't find the answer in another country or another religion or another branch of science, you have to hypothetically place yourself outside the human experience altogether.
Wow.
You have to conceptualize humanity from orbit to realize how trivial and theoretically solvable our localized conflicts might actually be when viewed from a completely different scale.
It's a complete reframing of perspective, which ties perfectly back to a core principle the author mentions, referencing the title of a past article they wrote. The title was, "When you think you're right, you're already wrong."
Right.
The moment you believe your circle of cognition is complete, the moment you believe you have all the necessary variables, you've just constructed a new boundary around yourself.
Exactly. Closing ourselves off, settling into the comfort of being right, it guarantees that we will simply follow in the footsteps of past mistakes. The author states plainly that without this continuous outward expansion, humanity is doomed to remain trapped in a cycle of suffering for another 10,000 years.
10,000 years.
Yeah, it's an endless loop of optimizing our own misery.
So let's bring this deep dive back to the immediate reality of you listening right now and how this actually applies to your daily habits and decisions. Because the author concludes with a very stark summary outlining the exact behaviors that build these restrictive boundaries in the first place.
The author lists the behavioral red flags very clearly. The actions that trap us are isolationism, closing our eyes and ears to opposing viewpoints,
Right.
actively blocking external information, shouting internal slogans rather than engaging in dialogue, and paying no attention to external affairs.
And these are so common.
They are. It is crucial to understand that these aren't just descriptions of failed national policies. These are daily psychological habits that we all default to when we feel overwhelmed and we just crave the security of a closed system.
Absolutely.
And the author promises a very specific, devastating cascade of results if we indulge in those behaviors: ignorance, backwardness, barbarism, and ultimately extinction.
It's a chilling logical progression. If you actively block external information, you manufacture your own ignorance. Ignorance inevitably causes you to fall behind the development of external systems. Falling behind breeds barbarism as resources dwindle and internal conflicts rise.
Right.
And barbarism eventually leads to systemic extinction. The stakes of refusing to step outside your boundaries are, according to this framework, quite literally life and death.
But as we analyze this text, there's a profound nuance to this philosophy of expansion that I think requires us to push just a little further.
Yeah.
Something for you to mull over after this deep dive ends.
Okay, let's hear it.
The author repeatedly urges us to step outside our limitations, to find the solutions others discovered centuries ago, and to walk out into the bright spring scenery.
Right. To actively seek out the sunlight and the open air.
But consider the reality of that action. What happens when you successfully manage to step outside your boundary, you feel the sunlight, you see the clear mountains, and you realize the truth of the broader world, but the people you deeply care about refuse to follow you?
Oh, wow.
How do you communicate the reality of that open sky to someone who vehemently insists that the damp, dark walls of their specific system are the entirety of the universe?
That's a huge problem.
Do you exhaust yourself trying to drag them out against their will? Or do you have to make the agonizing choice to leave them behind in order to embrace the light yourself?
That is the hidden cost of expanding your boundaries, isn't it? The air outside might be fresh and the perspective might be true, but it can be an incredibly lonely landscape if you are the only one who made the journey.
Yeah, it really can be.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today. Keep questioning the parameters of your surroundings, keep looking for the sunlight, and whatever you do, keep exploring beyond your own boundaries. We'll catch you next time.